Peter Derk does a lot of writing for Lit Reactor. He is kind of anti-social media, so I can't ever tag him in anything. Oh, you read this one? Good. I was reading it the other day. I was having to choose between this and a couple others that I really enjoyed. But I decided to jump in on this one. I felt it was timely and people could pick up something from it. And of course, there were some things that I didn't necessarily 100% agree with. So that's always makes for some interesting reading. So we'll dive right in here. Peter says it's been too long since I've heard a really bizarre conspiracy theory about COVID. I kind of like this little bit that he opens up with. It's too early to call COVID completely over, but based on the slowdown of bonkers theories around it, we're getting there. It's been a bit since I've heard a new theory as stupid as government chips in vaccines. Amazon started it all, and so forth. There, I really found that interesting and just beyond the article anyway. And part of that idea of like the idea that conspiracy theories come down as something gets accepted. That's true of everything, like government programs that people get used to, changes in society that we get used to. Not to my knowledge. They probably profited from it because we have sent them plenty of money to get our supplies since this started. But it is interesting that like all that stuff kind of tamps down a little bit. It never goes away completely, but that may be an interesting gauge to see how accepted something is as just a way of life, and people begin to forget about it in terms of the craziness. But jumping back in, didn't you always figure that during an event like this, where you were stuck inside, where there was nothing to do, that you'd bang out at least a book, if not two, that a world without distraction would be ideal for writing, and yet you didn't finish your novel? What the hell happened? Now, I had a fairly productive pandemic, I guess you'd say. Part of it was that I'd already written a few things, and there was stuff that I was planning to publish this year in 2021 in some alternate universe where everything was normal. But a couple things I had out started to sell pretty well. And so in one case, a publisher wanted to move something up. In another case, I had a series that I was going to launch this year, but I went ahead and launched it last year because my other young reader series was doing well. So I kind of capitalized on that. Now, those high numbers didn't last forever, but I ended up publishing a ridiculous number of books last year, and then did a good bit of writing. Probably not as much as I have planned, but I don't think that's different from any year. We always tend to plan more than we can actually accomplish as a human being. But I did okay. But let's look into the idea of where maybe it didn't work out for everybody. All right, first section, your life didn't change. Maybe you didn't finish your book because your life didn't change. There are two flavors of a life that's mostly unchanged during COVID. And I have a little bit of a disagreement with him on this. Of course, obviously a lot of this is tongue in cheek, so I'm not bashing him or claiming that everything he's saying is meant to be taken literally. Okay, flavor one. You've got a job or obligations that didn't change much during the pandemic. If that's you, COVID didn't free you up at all. In fact, you were probably busier. You get a pass, okay? That can be for people that were already working from home. So my wife and I were fortunate in the sense that our careers, in my case writing, in her case some other companies that she works for remotely, we pretty much were able to do what we normally did. We were already homeschooling our kids. No bashing on the school systems or anything, but our kids just had some specific things that they needed help with. The fact that we were both home gave us an opportunity to help work on those things. And so it was like a year or two before the pandemic, we already had our kids at home. So our life did not change very much, other than the fact that I stayed inside a lot more because being a kidney transplant patient, I had to take this very, very seriously. And so I really haven't gone out to do much of anything. That may be part of the reason why I did okay in terms of writing for the pandemic. I was already accustomed to this isolation, I suppose. All right, flavor B, he says, your life didn't change because you ignored COVID. If you got on a plane after March 2020 and it wasn't 100% required, then what you've learned is that you will not buckle down and work when conditions for doing so are perfect. When everything about the world is encouraging you to stay home, maybe you should have stayed home like the rest of us, and maybe your unfinished novel taunting you is your cosmic punishment. Now, I do think there's other forms of this. Like your life could have changed, but not in a way that lended itself to it. Now, he gets into distractions and that kind of thing as he goes down into the article, but your life could change in a way that's not conducive to getting your novel done. So if you're not used to being home, and you got home and now you're having to work and stuff from home, or some days you were called into work, some days you weren't, and it changed from day to day, that doesn't lend itself to a pattern. And he gets into the distraction idea later, but also being afraid for your life, or being afraid for your welfare, your economics. I think all those things kind of get in the way. And there's been a lot of argument about COVID, obviously, with those that split along political lines, and ones that were taking it seriously and others that appeared to not be. I think there's something deeper to that. And I've talked about this some briefly closer to the beginning of the pandemic, but I think sometimes the divisions were more along the lines of what you feared. So in my case, being a kidney transplant patient, being someone who could work from home so that my economics didn't change a lot, other than, what are people buying and where do you have money to spend. My fears fell along the lines of being afraid of the disease. And so I took the precautions and I kind of fell into that camp. Other people feared the economics. Like their biggest risk in their estimation was that the changes to their job was putting them at risk. And so sometimes the lockdowns and things like that became a little more personal to some people, because it was affecting business, it was hitting them at a bad time economically, and it did look like a disaster. And so their push might have been in the other direction. Hey, General, thanks for dropping in. So I try not to, as much as I'm pro-vaccine and I'm pro, precautions and all that, and I'm going to be taking precautions longer than most people. I try not to put everybody who's in the other camp, everybody who kind of wanted things to go back to normal sooner, as all being a problem, because again, we're both reacting to a fear. My fear being my health, their fear being, the greater fear for them being economics, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they didn't take health seriously. I'll talk to you a little bit later about it. Have written a little thing, want to read it. So in terms of the divide there, I think there's room for understanding. But of course, you're dealing with a pandemic, so everybody's kind of heightened. But moving along here, if your life didn't change, this is Peter talking again. If your life didn't change because of things outside your control, don't beat yourself up. But also recognize the global pandemic wasn't enough to provide you more writing time, so it's pretty unlikely that writing time will fall in your lap. You need to fix the problem for yourself. That I could agree with. If your life didn't change because you're a stubborn ass and probably a little selfish, again, he's coming down on folks that didn't follow along with the lockdowns, I guess. Recognize that if a potentially fatally virus can't convince you to stay the fuck home and write, if the threat of illness and death isn't enough to glue you to your keyboard, absolutely no external factor will. You'll have to find motivation somewhere else. Again, I think that may be a bit harsh, but I think he was trying to be funny about it. You were distracted. Okay. Peter says, to say that there were a lot of distractions in 2020 is like saying that going to bed a normal man and waking up a cockroach was somewhat inconvenient. However, if your book wasn't interesting enough to keep you engaged in writing it during 2020, it probably won't be interesting enough to keep your readers engaged in reading it in 2021 either. I can see his point there. I don't necessarily agree with it 100%. Your book is going to be in the real world, and distractions are part of the real world. That's true. If you didn't finish your book because it wasn't interesting enough to complete with 2020, you can either wait for the world to become boring. I put this somewhere in whatever year the sun flares out, or you can fix your book. Your book has to be more interesting than the real world for at least as long as it takes a person to read it. If you weren't interested in it on that level, don't expect anyone else to be. Now, he does have a point there. If your book can't hold your own interest, then you're putting out a big ask for other people to be interested in it. The disagreement I would have is that there are more factors involved. So a person that has an attention problem would would it's not the same thing as being bored with your work. I would also say that people who are struggling with depression, people who had family members that were in danger, all of these factors work in distractions that don't have anything to do with being bored. I think someone may have jumped in with exactly what I'm talking about here. Zach, I was furloughed at the start of the pandemic and started a new job remotely, but I was having a real hard time working from home. That is a huge adjustment. Found out at age 38 that I have ADHD. It was stressing me out and making it hard to write for myself. I agree 100%. Um, I recently left the marketing job and am starting a warehouse job. Oddly enough, I think it'll help with finding mental energy to write for myself at home again. And I think you're illustrating my point a good bit there. I'm a little more. I think I'm geared towards work from home. So like that really falls into my wheelhouse. Part of it is I'm writing full time, so I really don't have. I'm not competing with two directions. It's really just competing with myself and then sitting myself down in the chair. Um, but if you had a job from home, and I know writers who dealt with this, when work came home, life was all work. So like there was not a clear division point for getting work done, and having life and work mixing like that didn't lend itself to being able to divide time very well. I think you make a really good point in the idea that finding a job that's outside the home, again, and one that's more physical maybe than the mental aspect of it. Not that there's not mental aspect to working in a warehouse. I'm not implying that, but the different demand on your mental resources may actually lend itself to doing better. Now, of course, that depends on what hours you're working and being able to get home and how you feel, and if you are very tired and how you react to being tired and all those kind of things. All these factors go in. It also depends on whether you had a good day or a bad day. That's a huge thing that I think we try to gloss over as writers. We're like, well, if you can't write when you had a bad day, this, that, and the other thing. And I don't think that's really fair to how real life works. But you may be in a situation where you may be physically tired. Your mental capacity may be better, so to where you have more mental energy to work after work than you did even when you're working, maybe even working on the same computer that you write on and that kind of thing. So again, I do want to give Peter credit for the fact that when he's talking about this section, he is tongue in cheek, so he's not trying to slam anybody, and he's not necessarily being literal. He's just sort of hitting on one particular point. But again, like I said, there's some areas where I disagree here, and that's probably one of them. Although the underlying point of you need to have a novel that's interesting enough that it holds you as a writer at the same time that it's going to hold the readers. I think there's some validity to that, even though it doesn't bring in all the factors. All right, this section's a little more harsh. Peter says, you're not a writer. If you aren't taking a crap every now and then, something's wrong. Some people go every day, some every couple days. But for any human, if you go too long without taking a dump, you'll be pretty uncomfortable. Kind of a clumsy metaphor here, but he's getting to a point. If you're a writer and if you don't feel compelled to write on a regularish basis, something's wrong. Doesn't have to be every day, doesn't have to be every week, but if you're not writing and if that feels natural to you, you might not be a writer. Here we are. COVID knocked a lot of people out of their routines, and this is good and bad. That is, I would agree with that 100%. It's bad when your routine was being sober at 11 a.m. on a weekend. Again, he's probably joking a little bit. But it's good when your routine was to blow $80 at Target every weekend. If COVID knocked you out of your writing routine, maybe that's bad, and it's time to get back on the horse. Maybe it's good because maybe writing isn't what fulfills you. I'm going to push back against this a little bit. Maybe it's something you felt like you should do. Maybe it's something you just got used to doing, but it wasn't scratching that itch anymore. If you got knocked out of your writing routine, instead of cramming yourself right back in, take this as a chance to figure out if this is really how you want to spend your time. Now, one thing I'll say is that if it's easy to discourage you from writing, and I don't mean that in the sense that life gets in the way and you go a couple days without writing. I'm not talking about that at all. I think writers need to give themselves more of a break on that kind of stuff, because feeling bad and guilty about it doesn't really motivate either. But if if it's easy to talk you out of it, like if you don't think about yourself as a writer or an author, and then somebody saying, well, this isn't very good, makes you think, well, I'm just going to quit, then you may not have the staying power. And I don't mean that to discourage, but I am going to say that there's plenty of built-in discouragement in writing, and a lot of times even from people who should care about you and encourage you and that kind of thing. There's plenty of people who will try to talk you out at plenty of situations that will discourage you. Now, if the discouragement causes you to kind of fall back and not really accomplish as much and kind of feel bad, but then you kind of get back to it, then that's a different thing, I think. And I would say that the lesson here is not necessarily that you're not a writer, because I don't think writing's like taking a dump. I think taking a dump's a lot easier. I think I made since we're working in clumsy metaphors, I would make the metaphor that writing is like being a murderer. So if you murder somebody and you hide their body in the yard, and then you kind of try to go about your business and you're kind of going through natural life, it may be possible that no one knows you're a murderer. It may be possible that no one even suspects. It may be possible that some people know, but they're keeping it quiet. You may be a world famous murderer someday. You may not be. But the fact that you got somebody buried in your backyard means that you're something other than the normal human being. I kind of think writing is the same way. You can be a full-time writer, part-time. You can be... you can write a lot, and in a period of time, you could go a period of time where you're kind of struggling or not getting it done. But I think writing's like murder. If you've done it, you're a writer. And murder's the same way. You might go a long time between murders. You may not make very much money doing it, but in the end, you are something like that. And if you're caught doing it, if people start reading the stories that you made or finding the bodies in the backyard that you buried, then you're going to get labeled a murderer. You're going to get labeled a writer. And so I think that's a pretty good sign that you're into it, even if like there's all these things getting away of your murders or your writing. Everyone doesn't have a body in their backyard. Very good stuff. Morbid metaphor, I know. I think it's more apt though. I think writing is bloody and clumsy and dirty work. So I think the murder analogy works pretty well. Again, allowing for clumsy metaphors here. But I would say I kind of looked at teaching the same way too. I was a teacher for 16 years before I started writing full time, and my view on we all aspire to be Dexter on the page. Good stuff. My view was that teaching was very, very difficult, and it was very difficult in ways that were difficult to describe to someone who hadn't been to it. So you almost had to get into the field to understand whether you were made for it. And if someone needed to be encouraged to be a teacher, then I was reticent to participate in that, because you don't really know what you're getting into until you're into it. And if you're not sure, that's kind of something you need to come to grips with before you get in. Because if you go in tentatively to teaching, you're going to be rocked on your heels a little bit. So I always felt like if someone who wanted to be a teacher could be talked into anything else, then that's probably what they should do. Because the ability to be talked out of it is probably what's going to mean that when the hard times of teaching hit, it's going to knock you off the horse. Writing may be like that too. If it's possible for somebody to talk you out of it, then you may not be ready for what's about to hit. That being said, I would say don't let people talk you out of it. I would say establish the iron within you that makes you do what you feel like you're called to do, and then push against all the odds. Because being successful at something, especially something as ethereal as writing, and I mean that in ephemeral, I guess is the word I'm looking for. I'm stumbling on my vocabulary here. I'd say it's ephemeral because like being able to make a living at it, being able to find avenues that work for writing, all these things are tough gets. There's such a small percentage of people that become super successful, and there's still a small percentage of people who can make a living at it, small percentage of people who reach like the minor levels of success that we want. So you really have to be the kind of person that believes you can beat the odds, that you can do something that other people can't do. And so that sort of cockiness, that sort of I don't know if delusion's the right word, but let's use it anyway. That sort of self-delusion that you can go into something that's basically designed for your failure in a sense, but you're going to go after it anyway. That's kind of what it takes to stick with something like writing, especially if you're looking at making a living at it. If you enjoy doing it and you're just trying to get some stories out there and create and that kind of thing, you're probably a healthier version of a writer than most people I know. But again, don't let someone talk you out of it. If you can be talked out of it, you're probably not ready for all the things that come with trying to make a go at writing. So I hope that's as encouraging as I want it to sound. I believe in I believe part of my success is believing my own myth. And what I mean by that is that I kind of have to create sort of a self-delusion, because every time I mess up a story, every time I get a rejection, all those kind of things, those are strong evidences that a story is not good or that I'm not doing a good job or all that kind of thing. But the myth I choose to believe is that I'm good at what I'm doing, I'm getting better at what I'm doing, and I'm capable of greatness. Now, I chose to believe this about myself very early on when I was definitely not writing my best work. So I kind of had to believe that myth in order to reach a point to where it became more true. And so for writing, instead of letting someone talk you out of it, I would say see if you can convince yourself to believe in your own myth. Now, of course, there's some advantage to having a realistic view of things, so you're not like running headfirst into every new thing that opens up and thinking you're going to make $1 million. But there probably has to be part of you that kind of believes the myth that it could happen, that you could make $1 million trying this thing or that thing with writing. And I think that that healthy belief in your own myth is really the thing that makes you last. And with anything in life, whether it's writing or anything else, sometimes being successful at something is the refusal to quit. So you have all these years and all this time where you're not accomplishing anything with writing that you feel like, but you choose to keep going anyway, even though there's evidence that maybe you should give up. And because you refuse to quit, you haven't failed yet. And because you refuse to quit, you haven't failed yet. And that continues and continues until you see a little bit of success. Now you have a little success. But after that, you find some more setbacks, but you refuse to quit. And eventually, these refusals and these small successes build into something that you can really put in front of yourself and say, I'm accomplishing something. I'm good at this. This is something I'm meant to do. So when you feel discouraged, when you feel someone trying to talk you out of it, when life seems to be trying to talk you out of it, I would say figure out what your myth is and then start to believe your own myth. Jumping back into Peter's article here. Post-COVID. So you weren't the writer you wanted to be during COVID. I think a lot of us went through that. Pre-COVID and post-COVID, those are the long periods, the critical periods. The time that passed during COVID, those 2 years, those will fade. A lot of what you slacked on, that's all forgettable and forgivable, but only if you change. I can buy into that. Instead of crying over your unfinished novel, be the writer you want to be post-COVID era, a period that's also known as the rest of your life. I think that's a beautiful way to end that article. I will say that like authors and writers would do a lot better if they were able to let go of the bad days. I don't keep track of word counts beyond the idea of like if I have a deadline, I know I have to write 2,000 words a day or 1,000 words a day, whatever it is, to get that thing in on time. So I'll set word minimums. Like I know, okay, I'm starting at this word count. I need to get to at least this word count today in order to stay on track. And so I'll do that. But as I'm writing other things, I don't track from day to day. So I don't know that I don't know how many words I wrote on Monday, how many words I wrote on Tuesday. I don't know if Wednesday was a bust. Now, of course, on the day when you're having a bad day and you don't get a lot done or you don't get anything done, that can feel bad. But you don't want that to drag you down. So on a micro level, I would say the more you can let go of bad days of writing, the better your days will be, because one bad day of writing can ruin your week if you're tracking word counts. Now, I'm not saying don't track word counts, because it's probably the most effective way to keep track of getting your work done, to keep yourself motivated. But you got to also find a way to not let that bad Wednesday ruin the rest of what was a good week, to be able to jump in and start over on Thursday. One reason I stopped tracking word counts, except when I had to do word minimums for a deadline, was so that when I did have a bad day, it didn't affect the next day. The next day, I just woke up and I just forget what happened yesterday and start again where I left off, or whatever thing I needed to get done that day. On the big level, you have these year-long goals. You want to get these novels done. When you fall short on those, there needs to be a way to let those go without giving up on trying. So if you need another 3 months to finish the novel or whatever it is, then grant yourself that and move forward with it, because that's better than just saying, well, I failed again at this thing or that thing. And that kind of thinking can also mess you up, to where if you had 4 or 5 goals that you wanted to get done, but you only got 3 of them done, some people will look at that as a failure. Well, I failed 2 goals, as opposed to I accomplished these 3 things and I made progress on these 2, or I'm going to have to save this one over until later. So the more we could kind of, I guess it's glass half full, glass half empty. The more that we could glass half full our writing goals and that kind of thing, I think the better off we're going to end up being. I'm not trying to be a Pollyanna here, where I'm pushing all positive, everything's bright and glowy kind of things. But just like believing your own myth that I brought up earlier, I think the idea of being able to change your perspective on something gives you an advantage to going after it. There's obviously plenty of things to discourage and plenty of things to look at and say, well, none of this is working the way I want it to. But the more you can focus on, okay, I accomplished this thing, I can step on there and make another step up to the next thing, the better off you're going to be, and the less you're going to be dragged down, because there's plenty of things each day to kind of knock you off your feet, whether it's writing or life or anything else.